They have a thought first. That thought comes. That leads to the behavior. So our intervention shouldn't be, like he said earlier, after the behavior. And we shouldn't be consequencing the behavior. We should be consequencing and working on the thought that led to the behavior. And he's going to talk to you a lot about that right now. Right. There you go.
35 extra minutes of fun.
Yeah, there you go, buddy. Go at it.
So, as Bob said, we're going to talk about that thought process, right? And as a school psychologist, I assess kids that have been referred for emotional impairment. They're not always emotionally impaired kids, but they're referred because we're looking at outcome behaviors, right? We're looking at what the kid did. You know, you never see, like I said, you never see a discipline referral that says, hey, you know, Chuck made a really poor decision. You know, he didn't exercise all his options. It usually describes the behavior, the outcome. It was aggressive, verbally abusive, whatever. So when we look at that, we know that trauma changes the brain. As a school neuropsych, there's a lot of evidence out there that we know that brain chemistry is changed due to stressors, right? And especially at the early developmental time for kids. If there's been undue stress on that child, it changes a lot. And it changes first their perspective, how they view the world, okay? My assignment right now, I have two assignments. I have an assignment at just your run-of-the-mill, regular old elementary school, and my other assignment is at an early childhood center with 400 kids that have IEPs between 3 and 5 years old, right? So we're dealing with them, we're catching them while they're young. Hopefully we can make a change, because guess what? The good news is that although trauma and stressors affect brain development, neurocircuitry, things like that, they can be reversed. They can be changed too. Interventions can change the brain, and we're going to talk about that. So how do I know that the perspective of these kids that are oppositional and defiant, how do I know that it's not just them trying to be a badass kid? It's about the way they view the world, and the way they view the world is based on their childhood experiences, their adverse childhood experiences very often. So I'll give you some information that I have that tells me that I'm on the right track. As a school psychologist, I give, and I know there's a school psychologist or two in this group here and some other clinical folks, I give an assessment tool to kids that have presenting with some significant emotional problems. And the assessment tool is called Robert's Apperception Test for Children. Anyone ever hear of that? No? Okay. You hear projective techniques and people go, oh, hocus pocus and all that. You know, it's not the Rorschach, you know. I'm not interested if a kid says, I see a crab crawling up the side of the Empire State Building. You know, that's not me. The Roberts is more of a, well, for starters, it's a norm-based projective technique, almost an oxymoron, right? But what it does is it presents picture cards and asks kids to develop stories based on the picture that I'm presenting. And the cards are controlled for sex and race. So there's a separate set of cards for Latino males, a separate set of cards for Caucasian females, African American females. So there's situational cards that have what are considered either very slightly provocative or very neutral situations. And I'll show you the evidence that I have. The first card is a family, and they're standing there having a discussion, right? There's a boy and a girl and a mom and a dad, and they're looking at each other, right? And so I present the card, and the way the directions go is I'm going to show you a picture of a card. I want you to study this card for a minute or so and think about it. Then I want you to make up a story. I want you to tell me what happened before this, what's going on in the card, and how is the story going to end. Do your best job, and I ask them to talk about it. Some kids just describe the card. But what I get with kids that have severe and significant behaviors from that picture that I just showed you is, if it's the boy card, and whichever the target person is the older child, is the boy card, he'll say, he's in trouble. His sister just ratted him out. He got in a fight at school, and now he's getting a whooping, and the dad says to him, get up in your room, and the mom says to him, no video for 3 days, but he knows he's going to get it back the next day. And then he turns around and looks at his sister and says, I'm going to get you back. This isn't over. And I present that same set of cards to a typically developing kid, that same exact picture, and you know what I get? Hey, they're deciding where they're going to go for dinner. Dad's saying it's her turn to pick, and she's saying, is it fast food? And mom's saying, yeah, you got to choose from Mickey D's or McDonald's. And the son says, well, can I supersize it? And then dad says, yeah, but you got to get it to go so we can get back for our homework. This is the same exact situation and how two different people view it, based on the experiences in their life. One has a very negative, one has a very threatening point of view, where life consists of problems and challenges, and life consists of adults putting restrictions on you and telling you what to do, and everything has a negative connotation. Sometimes there's 16 cards, and I very rarely give the whole thing, but out of those 16 cards, when I do, I'll get 14 or 15 different problem situations out of some kids, where every single card, no matter how neutral the card is, somehow they've invented a problem and a conflict and a limitation by an adult and no support by others and things like that. Because of the experiences they've had, the way their brain chemistry looks, they are constantly in that fight or flight mode. So if I have that kind of evidence that tells me, hey, this is always in a negative perspective, why am I surprised when a kid walks into a new class and they're the new student and everyone turns and looks to him and that kid looks back and says, you want a piece of this? What are you looking at? What's wrong with you? You want to go? Right? Because in his world, everything's threatening, whereas the typically developing kid walks in and says, oh, you like my shirt? I got it at the Gap before they went out of business. And yeah, how's that teacher? She's pretty cool. Yeah. Just a typically developing kid, because their view and their support and their perspective in life is very different. So we have to think about that when we start to address kids because of the outcome behaviors instead of because of the thinking. So what do we really need to do? Do we need to wait till that kid gets in a fight and then say, oh, now we have to deal with this discipline? Or do we need to change that thinking and challenge those negative thoughts, that negative perspective, and have the child actually have to support why they're thinking that way? And then we have to correct those distortions. And it's not done overnight, but it's done by allowing that child to understand that they need to support what they're actually thinking. Because what they're doing is feeling the threat first, and then they're attributing it to the situation. They're finding a reason to connect it to the feeling they already have. So we need to think about that. So we know that trauma impacts cognitive development, right? We know that kids that have been that have experienced trauma over and over, let's say neglect or abuse, or just lack of attention or connection with parents and love and concern and understanding. You doubt it? I do what I call Walmart studies. Just go to Walmart and follow around someone who has a kid in the cart. Doesn't take long. That kid's under 3 or 4 years old. He's got a screen in his hand. Mom's looking for stuff, and the only interaction is, I think the battery's dead. And it's an unfortunate thing because of the way society is. And it doesn't mean that that's a bad parent. That parent's following society's rules where we got to earn more, buy more, and make our kid happy through what we give them. So we have to teach and reteach cognitive skills, right? If we're going to change that perspective taking, we have to reteach that. That is a skill. It is amazing that when we address behaviors, we think we just need to inform the person. And then once we've informed them and we're certain that they heard the rule or the limitation of the adult, if they don't do it, then they're purposely not doing it. We never view behavior as a skill. And behavior is a skill that needs to be taught. Some kids get it for years, their parents support it, they explain to them, they know why they have to behave. Other kids never get it, and so they never gain that skill. Could you imagine if you presented long division to a 4th grader and he didn't get it the first time? I've covered that already, and you're purposely not doing it, because I've told you. It doesn't work like that. But we don't view behavior as a skill. Behavior is a skill that needs to be taught and reinforced. Why do you think these kids are here? A lot of these kids are here because their behavior is such that they never had the skill to start with. And do you think they're going to get it just by posting a set of rules on the board? Nope. Like any skill, it needs to be assessed, it needs to be taught, there needs to be opportunities for practice, and there needs to be progress monitoring. Right? So We're going to do a couple easy techniques. I don't know that the cards went around. We're not going to use those yet, but I'm going to show you some easy techniques. And all these techniques are designed around perspective taking. I want to understand why a kid views things this way. Because if you look at it in a neuropsychological perspective, there's two kinds of ways we can react to sensory information coming in. One is we can take the thalamic pathway. That's the information comes in, we pair it with either a fear or not fear instantly, and we react accordingly, right? And there's a reason for that primitive thalamic response. It preserves us. You know, if I step off a curb and I hear a big horn beep, I don't go, oh, let me see the make and model. Should I move? No, I immediately step back because I've been alerted and there's fear involved in that and I don't have to think it through. But sometimes these kids respond to everything in that way. Everything is a threat. So we need to teach them some strategies that, one, get them to stop and assess what they're feeling, right? And once they assess that feeling, can I get that under control? Is there a reason for me to be feeling this or not? And if there's a reason, fine. But if there's not, okay. Now you need to reframe. Because basic cognitive behavioral therapy is to relax, reframe, and cope. And so the relax part is get a hold of what I'm feeling. The reframe is to ask the question, what else could this mean? Just like that boy walking in the class, you want a piece of me. He never asked, what else could that mean? Could they be admiring my attire? I don't know. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. So the threat isn't there because I've thought it through. And then last, cope. And where did these kids fall short? They don't have the coping strategies in place because we don't teach them. We expect they know what they're supposed to do. Correct kids, we usually tell them about what they're doing wrong and we forget to tell them what they need to be doing, right? I mean, honestly, I have a whole list of things that I call the unanswerable questions where we paint kids into a corner, you know? Who's talking back there? Well, that would be me. No, that's not going to happen, right? Why are you out of line? Well, I don't know what the line is. Yeah. I mean, honestly, you know, we put these kids in a position where that doesn't do anything but create the reason for them to feel that kind of feeling by asking them questions that can't be answered. Why are you talking? My lips are moving, words are coming out. I mean, you know, I don't know. What is the answer to that why are you talking question, right? Who do you think you are? Let me check my ID. I'll be with you in a minute. You know, I don't know. It's just the idea that we paint kids into a corner. So we need to try to minimize that heightened state of arousal so that they can make good decisions. And we need to provide opportunities for practice. But first, we need to teach kids to support the perspective that they're taking. And we're going to do a couple activities. If I can figure out this clicker here. One is called Artful Thinking Routines. A couple years ago, my buddy over here was sponsoring a training. And in the afternoon, my wife was catering the event. In the afternoon, I was supposed to be helping her clean up, but instead I was like checking out the presentation for the afternoon. And next thing you know, I wasn't much help to my wife, and I was participating in this. Because I looked at it and I said, wow, this is pretty cool. This is about perspective taking. This is about kids supporting why they're saying that this situation is the way that it is. And I'll show you how it works. Thinking routines are like turning the brain on. They're asking kids to think about what they're feeling. They're asking the kids to think about how they're feeling what they're feeling. And there might be slides that aren't included in your slides. That's not my fault. It's his fault. I'll blame him. You guys are used to people blaming other people, right?
I love guilt.
Yeah. Makes me feel better than he. No, I'm just kidding. So reasoning skills, right? We want to teach kids reasoning, perspective taking, and ask them to question and investigate before they make decisions, before they make that move that oftentimes gets them in trouble. Remember, we're going back to teaching these students to start assessing the process of making the decision. Not about teaching them no fighting. No fighting? What does that mean? That I'm permitted to walk out? Does no fighting mean I can cut school? I'm not fighting anymore. I guess that, but we're not telling them what they need to do, right? So we need to make sure that we give them the tools to question and investigate the things that are in their environment that might be challenging to them. We want them to observe and describe these things and compare and connect. And why? Because this is training, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy includes a training component that gives them those coping strategies. Something we're teaching them, a strategy in order to think about what they're doing before they do it. Because remember, we have to relax, which is stop what you're doing and assess it, reframe, ask yourself the question, what else could this be? And then lastly, initiate a coping strategy. Well, we have to teach those possible, let's say, go-to coping strategies that keep them out of trouble, instead of just telling them what not to do. You know you're not supposed to be fighting. Yeah, well, I have about 7,000 other alternatives I can involve myself in, but telling them what they need to do instead. So I usually start off in any kind of training technique in working with kids. I start off with what I would consider a very neutral stimulus in order to teach the strategy first, because you want to eliminate the emotional component at first, so they understand the strategy, so that you don't get kind of mixed up. Is it that they don't understand what they're supposed to be doing, or they're too embarrassed, or it's too emotionally, too emotionally connected to them for them to be doing it? So first I teach the strategy, and unless you live in Idaho or Iowa or something, this probably isn't your world, right? So I teach the strategy, asking them, look at this. Tell me what you see here. What's going on? What are these people feeling? And then find out why they're feeling that way. Did they identify the facial features on this kid? You know, did they talk about that there's fear going on in there? You know? Or are they a kid formerly known as Asperger's who talks about all the animals and chickens and goats and everything and leaves out the people? But you know, you're asking them, oh, there's the struggle going on and they're scared. Why are they scared? How do you know that? I looked at the facial features. Or if they make something, a story up or a reason up that doesn't fit, you can clarify that. You can support that by saying, hey, maybe they're scared because look at their faces. Maybe there's a sense of urgency because they look like they're hurried. And then I switch to a situation that, situations that, in this one, a reasoning and supporting one would be one in which they can't be part of this situation, right? They're not a deer, you know? And ask them to look at this very neutral thing and explain, hey, what's going on here? What makes you say that? This snowman's nose is in serious trouble. Okay, what makes you say that? Did I miss one?
You can miss one, I'm going to take over because I don't think you're doing that good.
Okay, thanks.
I'll call you back when you're ready.
All right.
Okay, so we're going to do a little processing ourselves here. So when we do this training typically, what we do is we say, first of all, this is from Harvard. It's called Project Zero. All this stuff is up on the website, out of Harvard, 100% free. But our idea is, how do we directly teach thinking skills? And like Robert went over, here's the main thinking skills we think most children who have problems have a problem with. So when he was going over this slide, we take a look at it. Let's just go through this process one table at a time. So what do you guys see in this picture? Cyclone. Okay, so you see how he said a very descriptive, concrete item in the picture. So if you were a more advanced thinker, you would be thinking of other kinds of things besides just the concrete nature. So we want to move them from a concrete description of what they saw to...
The Wizard of Oz.
Sorry, man. So when you take a look at this picture, I'm going to give you a little clue. What feelings are you seeing in this picture? Fear. Okay, so what you're doing is you're teaching the child how to go from a concrete description of an event and move into what are the thoughts and feelings that are going on in this picture. So when you're teaching thinking skills and you're using a picture, you're thinking about this thing, that's where we're trying to go. Here's a concrete description. If you can do the concrete description, where's the thought, where's the feeling, and then after the thought and the feeling, we're going to go to something else. So what do you guys anticipate the next thing is? Concrete, thoughts and feelings. What's the next thing we're going to ask this kid about what's going on here in order to change his thinking skills and be thinking about things more broadly? What's the next thing?
What's going to happen next?
What's going to happen next? But really what we want to do is describe the relationship going on here, right? Because what makes this relationship work? The relationship here you see is what? What kind of relationship do these people have to each other? Family. Or what else? Neighbors. Helpful. But their relationship is helpful, supportive, right? So what we want to do is teach them, here's the thinking, and like Robert said, we use a neutral stimulus like this. Here's something we can train them on to start thinking like this. And then after we teach them concrete thoughts, feelings, relationships, the next thing we do, which is the essence of reason, is what makes you say that? So that's what reason is, right? There's a reason for me saying that. So when you say cyclone, what makes you say that? There's a cyclone there. That's pretty easy. But when you say the fear and the other feelings, what makes you say that you see fear in this picture? Faces. Now, do a lot of children interpret facial expressions appropriately, or do they respond, like Robert said, with an automatic, previous, established thinking? So that's kind of the idea, is if you're going to teach them how to think differently and react differently and start doing things differently, here's a very practical, absolutely free. Now, Harvard didn't put this up there for you guys. They didn't think about it in reference to us. They're teaching social studies with this. They're teaching science with it. They're teaching literature with it. But we're taking that same technique and saying, okay, how do you teach thinking skills that are appropriate for children who are not using thought to make decisions? So the idea is I'm expecting thought without teaching thought. I'm expecting thought without having them practice thought. I'm expecting a different response without directly teaching how would you get there. And I love this technique because it's very engaging and you can do a lot of things with it. So this first idea is, do you think your children have problems using reason to solve problems? Is reason as a separate category in your curriculum? Is reason out there? Is it reading, math, language arts, reasoning? No, it's not there. So how do you integrate this idea that I need them to use reasoning when it's not part of the curriculum? And that's what we're saying, is like, how do you integrate this same thing into a language arts activity, social studies activity, anything else? Because what should be not what were the basic causes of the Civil War, but what did people perceive, what were they thinking, what were they feeling, what were their relationships with other people, so then they start thinking like this too. So you're getting them in the habit of practicing thought to solve problems. So this is one. Are you just holding your pen? You want to ask me something? No. Okay, good. Put your pen down. They're distracting me. Sorry. Anyway, so.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay. So let me say,
Thank you.
what I should have said is, why are you holding your pen like that? That should have been probably better, right? How's that?
In my hand.
Okay, there you go. All right. Thanks, Robert. You're a lot of help, buddy. So after that first thinking skill, and they have these as broad categories where you can teach each one of these thinking skills. The other one is, let's take a look at this picture. And what do you see in this picture? What's going on here? Lunch. Okay? So you have curiosity, you have exploration, you have whatever. So here in the next thing, so they start with the reasoning skill, and then they say, reasoning isn't not enough. What we need is an expansion of the options of what's really going on. So then they say, you said lunch, how would you support that? Why would you say lunch here?
Because it's almost lunchtime right now.
Okay. Love it. So, now that you said lunch, what else could be going on here besides lunch?
Hesitation.
Pardon?
Hesitation.
Hesitation. But see, the idea isn't lunch hesitation. The idea is you thought one thing was going on. What else could be going on here besides that? So now you've gone from reasoning and saying, here's the reason I think that, to here's reasoning, but there might be another option here besides what I perceive. And then you say, is that a good thinking skill for children to have? is to not use their first choice of what they think's going on, but actually back up and say, well, maybe something else could be going on here besides just what I see. So that's what they're thinking about when they're talking about teaching thinking skills. Here's the first one. Why do you say that? Here's the second one. You said that. What's another possibility? What's another option here that could be looked at besides that? Here's the next one. We took this picture. We didn't take this from the Artful Thinking website. We took this picture from what we thought would be kind of a little bit more relevant, and that's perspective taking. So a lot of your students or other people you work with are able to see your point of view on things or only have their restricted point of view. So how would you teach somebody directly how to take other people's perspectives besides their own? And there's a very solid curriculum they have that's on there, but let's just walk through one. The first thing they say is, if you look at this picture, how many perspectives are there? Just list the number of perspectives available in this picture. So you have the ref over there, you have this guy back there, you have the guy on the ground, you got the guy running. You can make a list of all the different perspectives on this thing. So then,
50,000 people in the stands all have their own perspective.
let's not forget those guys in the fan base, okay? So then you say, does this have a, whoa, what happened? That's not it. How about this? No, it doesn't have
Greater
a,
than sign.
it doesn't have a point.
Yeah,
Oh, it does work. Thanks, Robert. So then you say, what's this guy thinking? What's this guy thinking? What's the ref over here thinking? What's this guy thinking? And then you go through and you say, here's each perspective. Here's what each person's probably thinking in reference to what's going on in this picture. So then, instead of constantly criticizing or expecting people to understand and see your point of view without directly teaching them how to understand and take somebody else's point of view. So it's a very direct way to say, here's a perspective taken. And if you go on Google Images, you can paste in any image you want here. You know, you could put in any. You could put a family therapy session. You could put somebody doing homework. You could put in any kind of picture in here and go through this process without necessarily using the artwork from the Artful Thinking website. So, here's the next one. People don't observe things accurately. They don't look at what's going on. And if you can't look and see outside of your own narrow environment, then you're not going to be able to take perspectives, reason, or see other people's point of view or have other options to do. So here's this, and we took this picture right here, not from Artful Thinking, but from Google Images, and it's like, look at this image. What do you see? Tell me 10 words about it. And then you say, all right, there's your 10 words. Now I want you to do 10 more, and I want you to do thoughts, feelings, and relationships as part of that 10 more. So you're expanding by teaching a thinking skill, which is I'm observing something, and then I'm describing it. Because if you can't see the world in which it really is and describe it, then your options for what you're going to do are what we call internalized options. It's lunchtime, I'm hungry, that's why I see lunch. And unless you can expand that look outside of the narrow one you have, then you're not going to really be able to explore the various options you have for doing things. Now here's the last one. See this picture? Some of you guys probably might recognize it's a famous Homer somebody picture from somewhere. But anyway, so let's look at this boat because the next problem, pardon?
That's the Homer guy from
Somewhere.
Simpsons, yeah.
Anyway, so let's take a look. Let's take a look at this picture and let's think about another thing. Robert and I have been psychologists for a long time. One of the thinking skills that children have that are very difficult to teach sometimes and to see a deficit in is what we call sequencing skills. First, next, last. And oftentimes when we do assessments, we're surprised at how little they're able to sequence events in order to be able to think through problems. Now let me ask you a question. If you're doing antecedent behavior consequence, you guys do that stuff? Okay. But you don't know first, middle, and last, do you think antecedent behavior consequence is going to work? But sometimes we presume the ability to sequence events before we expect them to sequence events. And so that's what I'm talking about. How do you teach sequencing before expecting the child to be able to sequence events? Because oftentimes our excellent behavior management skills programs don't particularly work, and we can't figure out why they don't. But we don't go back up and say, do you know how if I read you a story, and I got to the end of the story and I said, what happened first, what happened next, what happened last, you'll see a lot of kids can't put that stuff in order, even with a simple story. But then we're expecting them to understand antecedent behavior consequence when they don't understand sequencing at all. So I'm saying, you better check and make sure they understand sequencing and can do things in sequence and understand that before you're expecting that antecedent behavior consequence is going to work. So let's just go through this. Here's how they teach sequencing. Their first thing is describe what's going on now. So what's going on in this picture right now? What's happening in this picture? Sharks are swimming around the boat, right? What else is going on? Waves coming, storm, okay? So what they're saying is when you teach sequencing, don't go first, second, last. You do now and right before now. So what happened right before this guy's out in this boat in a storm with sharks circling? What happened before that? His mast broke, okay? What's he doing out there to begin with? Fishing, okay? So what they're saying is when you teach sequencing, you should have a visual response and you should say, what's going on right now? Once you do that, then you say, what happened right before this? Then you go to, what do you think is going to happen next? What do you think is going to happen next in this picture? Pardon?
Back to lunch.
Lunch, okay. So, I know we have a positive, yoga-minded, wonderful person in this room that has a potential positive outcome, even though it's very unlikely. Pardon? Let's do him first. We'll talk about the sharks next. So, you've got it. Okay, so, go ahead.
There's a boat on the farm.
For our kids, they might be confused, so would you then review it and put it in the right order? For a second.
Yes,
After
yes.
you-
But
after you get
first
that?
you teach it.
Yeah, and
First
then
you
put it in
teach
the
it,
right
and
order?
then you go over it.
Okay.
Who said that?
Behind you.
Yeah, there's a boat back there. What does that mean?
He's gonna get rescued.
He could get rescued. Now let's go. Now let's go to the big one. What's the difference in this picture? What's the difference between him getting rescued and shark bait? What's the difference?
Being
What is he doing? What's this guy doing? What's he doing? In laying down, what is he trying to do by laying down?
conserve energy.
Stay with the boat. Stabilize the boat. Keep it even. Keep it afloat, right? So, count it. I love this. So, what does that mean? Where do we go next? The outcome is dependent on your behavior, right? And that's a hard thing to teach sometimes. But you see, here's a very direct way to teach it. The outcome is dependent on what this person's doing. Shark bait, rescued, how long I can keep this boat afloat till maybe that other boat comes. So the idea is not only can you use this to teach sequencing, but you can also use it to say the outcome is dependent on what? The choices you make, the energy you put forward, the effort you're putting forward. So when you take a look at this kind of idea, that Harvard has put out this stuff, it's free, and it's a direct way to teach thinking for people who are not using thought to solve their problems. So that's what we're kind of saying is that when we talk about cognitive interventions, for children who have their cognitive functions impaired by early trauma or other kinds of things, here's a direct way to teach reasoning. Not necessarily by adding it to your curriculum per se, because you might have room in it. But this is a teaching method, right? We all have to teach sequencing. Here's how the Civil War started. Here's what happened first in the story. Here's what happened everywhere. We're teaching sequencing and expecting it all the time. But here's another method of going in and saying, okay, am I failing to have improvement in this child because I'm assuming a cognitive skill that he does not have or that's particularly impaired, and do I need to directly teach him that cognitive skill in order to get from this to antecedent behavior consequence depending on your behavior. And so a lot of times we're way ahead of what their actual capability of processing the information is, and we're not backing up and saying, am I teaching a cognitive skill before expecting them to particularly use it? And that's kind of what we're talking about when we're saying, here's a cognitive skill that we need to teach directly. Here's a cognitive skill we're going to teach directly versus expecting it before they actually know what we're talking about. All right, so we're going to, is that it? That's it. Good. So we're taking our 10 o'clock break, 4 minutes early, which means you have extra 4 minutes for your 10 o'clock break, which means we're going to come back at 10:10. We'll get started on some more stuff. All right, see you then.